So Kurt, your piece in this week's issue is the Person of the Year piece about the protester. Why is the protester the Person of the Year?
Well, as soon as you broached this possibility to me some time ago, it immediately made sense. I mean, first of all, protest has sort of fallen out of fashion as an effective political tool the last 20 years. When you and I were young, whether it was civil rights protests, anti-Vietnam protests, they were news and they were a big deal. That, in the last couple of decades, hasn't been so much the case. Not only did protest come back in this big, globally contagious way this year, but you know, we are 2 regimes down and counting. I mean, there's this incredible effect that makes it the biggest deal in more than a century in terms of this global sense of protesting against governments that are perceived as corrupt and ineffectual, and then consequence flowing from that.
And how did this all happen? Because as you say, protest, people getting off their couches, going into the streets, was something that seemed quaint and antiquated, and suddenly, in ways that we hadn't anticipated, it was a contagion.
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, obviously the conditions in places like Tunisia and Egypt are very different than the conditions in places like Greece and Spain and the United States. The stakes were very much higher. You have these educated, essentially, you know, non-poor, often middle-class young people who are facing high unemployment even as they are more and more part of the world, thanks to technology, thanks to the internet, thanks to Al Jazeera. They feel part of the world, and yet their ability to actually be, as many of them say, stars of their own lives, protagonists in their own lives, was being thwarted.
We went to Tunisia, and we went to Sidi Bouzid, which was this tiny little charmless dorp where Mohamed Bouazizi, you know, lit himself on fire. I was so struck by how wretched a place it was and how this enormous change, this revolutionary spirit, could have emanated from a place where you would drive by it and never think twice about it.
I mean, given what happened there, where this young man finally just couldn't take it anymore, the kind of bleakness of it in retrospect seems even more acute.
We were in Tahrir Square on the day that this second round of tumult actually began. I mean, it really was kind of an amazing experience. And I don't know about you, but I felt that the feeling, the sensibility wasn't a threatening or dangerous one. It was one of great enthusiasm and feeling like we're changing the world.
I mean, absolutely. It was interesting to me that there were just, you know, not uniformed people, just people, guys, who, you know, patted us down, asked to see our passport. There was this sort of ad hoc administration of it as though it were a government. It reminded me in that sense of Occupy Wall Street, which sort of created this own little municipality.
Now, your cousin, your nephew,
no, my nephew.
rather, was a stalwart in Occupied Wall Street. And in fact, one of the poignant moments in your story is how when we were in Egypt, in Cairo, you got a text message from him saying that the police were clearing out
that he'd been arrested. That he was in jail. He was there on the last day when the New York police finally cleared it out, just as we were in Tahrir Square. And then somebody else sent me an email version of his Facebook update saying, I'm out of jail and I'm fine.
Let's talk about the role of technology and how did that work?
The people who really started the revolutions both in Tunisia and in Egypt were not part of any organization. They were people who were outside of the Muslim Brotherhood, outside of politics by and large. So using Facebook, using Twitter, using cell phones and various other apps on their smartphones was an important means of getting the news out. So it became this parallel news media. I feel as though, if anything, the degree to which the social media were important in those revolutions and those protests has been understated.
Really, that it's been understated?
I think a bit. I mean, because again, if you really go day by day and hour by hour for the year before these revolutions ever happened and then the weeks that they were happening, the way that social media mobilized and directed protesters to this square at this time and so forth was really extraordinary. Which isn't to say it couldn't have happened without them, but in the event, it happened very much with them.
And what about this notion of social networks being contagious? You heard people in occupied Wall Street saying that they were looking at Egypt and Tunisia. You heard people in Greece saying that they were looking at Arab Spring. How did that all work?
It really was a series of dominoes, this contagion, where each one sort of learned from the next. I mean, the only reason Occupy Wall Street decided to set up a camp and stay there until they were forced out is because that's what they'd done in Madrid and Athens and elsewhere in Europe.
Right.
And that's, again, what's amazing about this year is that there were these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people all over the world, and not all young, although mostly young, who were really stepping up and doing more than pressing like on a Facebook page.
Right. So where do you see it all going? And because this is very much the beginning of something. It doesn't feel like the end of something.
The conditions and grievances in each place have their differences, but to me, the similarities are what's striking. Mm-hmm. A sort of sham democracy that doesn't really allow for change, corrupt politicians, ineffectual government. Mm-hmm. Well, those are the complaints in Moscow, those are the complaints in New York, those are the complaints in Madrid. At a very much more profound level, they were the complaints in Cairo and Tunis. So I don't believe this is going to be the fad of 2011.
As to what's happened during this past year, there's no better guide than the piece that you wrote for us.
That's very sweet.
So I recommend everybody reading it.
Well, thanks for letting me do it, and thanks for coming with me on the reporting trip to North Africa.